Hello everyone! I feel like as I'm pulling plants from my garden, I no longer have really pretty backdrops for you, so now you can enjoy the siding of our house and some empty trellises. Today what I'm going to go over are my worst gardening decisions that I made in 2023 and what I'm going to do differently next year. I already did my best decisions, so I'll link that video down below. I'm hoping by sharing this that someone else can avoid some of the mistakes that I made, or if you had the same issue, I'll tell you what I'm going to do about it, and you can let me know what you're going to do about it down in the comments. So let's just go ahead and jump into it. The first one was something I knew I shouldn't do, and I did it anyway, and that was using poor quality potting mix. So when I first started gardening, I would get my potting mix from like Home Depot or Lowe's, and then as I started going to actual garden centers, I could tell the difference in the quality of the potting mix that I was buying. So I always recommend go to the garden centers, get the good quality. I like a few different brands. I always like Purple Cow. Is it Bacto? I think that I like as well. I haven't yet been wronged by a potting soil brand from a garden center. But I did go to Home Depot this summer, and there were a bunch of Vigoro potting soil bags on sale. It was like, I don't know, it was like $6 a bag. It was very cheap. And potting soil, for me at least, I always think when I buy a bag, it's going to fill more of my containers than it does, and it can get pretty expensive. I definitely spend more, I think, per year on soil than I do on plants themselves, especially when I start from seed. So I bought like 8 bags of this Vigoro potting soil, and as I was opening the bags, I got some surprises. I believe there was a plant tag from a pepper plant, and again, this was in the bag before I opened it. There was also one of those like wax-coated twist ties that you can use to tie plants to a support, and there were a lot of rocks. I should have stopped at that point and not added the soil, but it was there, and I did. I didn't put it in any of my raised beds, though, because that's a lot harder to change out compared to my smaller pots. And the potting soil was just like clay. It was the thickest, like least well-draining soil I've ever seen. I can now understand why it's on sale. I will say I have gotten soil from Home Depot, and it's been fine, but some of the brands there are definitely a little bit iffy. So almost everything I planted just in the Vigoro, something died from too much moisture is what I'm assuming. It was really, I can't even explain it. Like, I probably could have made bricks out of it if I wanted to and let them dry in the sun, and that would have been fine. I did then later mix in some perlite, and I don't know if I mixed in like additional potting soil, and that seemed to do better. So I just need to amend like crazy anything that was using that brand of potting soil. So if you want to avoid that, again, I trust garden centers more than big box stores, and also if you open a bag of potting soil and there's random stuff in there that's not potting soil, maybe don't use it. So what I'm going to do differently next year is not buy that brand anymore. It's Vigoro, I think it was, and I'm just going to stick to the brands that I know that I can trust, especially because in a container garden on a rooftop, it's so much more difficult to swap out soil than if you're on the ground gardening in a container, so I need to be much more careful than I was this year. So that was my first bad decision. My next bad decision, which I don't think is my fault because it worked the year before, was leaving my tulip bulbs uncovered in my raised beds over the winter. So my raised beds are all of the wooden beds. I have the 4 on the front deck, the 3 on the back deck, and this will be my 3rd winter coming up here of trying to grow bulbs. And so the first year, which I guess was fall going into winter of 2021, I planted them. I didn't do anything to cover them in my raised beds, and they came up fine. I don't think it was like 100%, but it was at least like 90% of the tulip bulbs came up just fine. I did know that year anything in a smaller container did not come up, and it rotted. So last winter of 2022, I put all my smaller pots in my plastic greenhouse, which is actually going to be right here pretty soon. I need to find it and remember how to set it up. I overwintered containers of tulips, and those did great. They did not rot at all, but almost all of my tulip bulbs that were in my elevated beds rotted. I think I got maybe 5% of the tulips out front, and I don't think anything out here in the back actually came up. So what I'm going to do differently next year, and I will make a whole video on this and show you what I'm going to do, but I'm going to layer tarp on top of it. So that way it helps keep the excess moisture out. It helps keep the raised beds a little bit warmer because you actually don't want them to get too cold. That can also lead to rot. You want to kind of find that happy medium. So I'm going to tarp them all, and I'm going to see how that does. And if that does not work, I'm like knowing that I'm probably not going to follow through necessarily. I will be done with planting bulbs in my container garden. But we'll see. Because going through all that work in fall to have nothing happen in the spring just isn't really worth it if 3 years in a row it doesn't quite work. And you can get pre-sprouted bulbs in the spring to then plant. That's what I did with, I think, that center raised bed over there. So that's always an option. So this will be my final kind of attempt at overwintering, like tulips, daffodils. I think I have muscari and some of the giant alliums too. So fingers crossed it works better this winter. My next worst decision was not carefully reading the seed packets I bought. So I would say most of the seeds I buy the specific variety, so I know what I'm getting. I had the great idea of making one of my raised beds on the front deck all native plants because I have been studying them in my courses, understanding how important they are. And so I went online and I searched for native flower seeds for the Midwest. And what came up was an Eden Brothers seed packet called Wildflower, or Midwest Wildflowers. And of course, I would assume that that meant they were wildflowers for the Midwest. Not true. They were just flowers that can grow in the Midwest, whether they are native or not. So I ended up with a bunch of cosmos. What else did I have in there? Cornflower. A bunch of things that definitely weren't native. And then once I actually read the, not ingredients, but it had the list of all the plants on there. If I had read that ahead of time, I would have known that none of these were natives. Maybe there was some echinacea in there. I can't remember. If there were, it didn't grow in that raised bed. So because of that, I'm going to have to remove all of those plants. And then I got native seeds from Prairie Moon Nursery, which had a great filtering system so that I knew I was getting native seeds for my state and my area. So I need to redo that. I did still like the bed. Like, the plants were still pretty. They did really well. They're still blooming right now. But it wasn't at all what I was attempting to do. I'm also a little bit nervous because I think there was so much. I just sowed seeds in the winter and the spring, and there was so much in there that I have a feeling some of the non-native seeds are still going to be in there from the flowers from this year and compete with the native flowers potentially. And I had no idea cosmos were actually as aggressive and invasive as they are. So we're going to see how that goes. But had I read the seed packet, I would have been much more informed about what I was doing. So always, always, always make sure you're reading all the information on the seed packet. Also, everything, this I've definitely learned in the last few years, everything on like fertilizers or any type of sprays, anything you're using in the garden, read the instructions very carefully because you will learn a lot that you probably didn't know. Next was providing the proper support for my zinnias, specifically my giant zinnias, but also the ones that get to about 3 to 4 feet tall. In the past, I don't think I've really done much, and then it always gets later in the season when things are breaking off and falling, and then I try to like tie something together and it doesn't really work. I did much better with my dahlias. So dahlias, this year I used like 18-foot cages, the smaller tomato cages. That worked great. I think I'm going to have to do that for my zinnias, or maybe something a bit smaller because they don't get as like large as the dahlias, but I need to have support in place when I plant them or when they start growing and get them tied in to their spot. The packet, I believe, does say no staking required, even the giant ones that get like 5 to 6 feet, but that has not been my experience. It does get windier up here than if I was on the ground. And also because I'm planting a lot of them in elevated beds, they're already raised up off of my deck, so they have less protection from the wall around the deck from the wind. So it can get very windy up here. I need to prepare much better for that. So I don't think I'm going to use the cages because I think they take up too much space, whereas my dahlias are all in their own separate container. My zinnias are usually mixed in the beds, but something like just having, maybe I can use the extra metal bars from an old greenhouse and then tie with twine or something just ahead of time to make sure they stay up. Same thing if I do cosmos again. I don't know if I'm going to do the cosmos again or not, but those also went a little crazy. So I want to make sure I have support in place for anything that might potentially need support as they grow. Also with my zinnias is I did not do a great job of controlling for powdery mildew this year. I think I have bragged maybe too much in the past about not really having issues with powdery mildew, and it got everywhere, I feel like, this season in my garden. I think a lot of other gardeners were saying it was worse than it normally is for them too. But I mean, it got so bad, like leaves were completely covered, the branches were breaking off. So I just didn't really do anything to try to avoid it. And I also had some things wrong. So what I had wrong was I assumed that if the leaves were wet, like from rain, or if I'd watered them and got the water on the leaves, that is what causes powdery mildew. But it's actually not. It's when the leaves are dry, but it's really humid. Because if you get the leaves wet, then the powdery mildew can't stick to the leaves. So that actually helps. So trying to keep my leaves dry does not help with powdery mildew. What I'm going to do differently this year, or next year, is prune. It's very hard for me to prune because, again, with limited space, it's like, well, if I cut off a branch, I'm cutting off potential flowers, but I'd rather have a healthy plant. So I need to prune a lot more to keep the airflow going through my plants. I also need to space a little better for things that I know are more susceptible to powdery mildew, which again is very hard when I have a limited amount of space, but I know that it's going to be better for my garden. I also want to try potentially preventatively spraying for powdery mildew. So as it gets warmer and more humid, there is a spray that I think it's a baking soda and milk. I can't remember it off the top of my head, but you mix it together with water, spray it on the leaves, and my preventative spraying for budworms did seem to help a lot. I had less of them, and they didn't show up till a little bit later in the season. So I might just try the same thing with my zinnias, to do a preventative weekly spray, trying to keep the powdery mildew away, because zinnias can last until our first frost if I don't get powdery mildew on them and still look pretty good. So I'd love to be able to keep them around as long into the season as possible. If you do anything else to help prevent powdery mildew, let me know down below. So I would say those are all of the decisions I made that cause things to go a bit wrong in the garden. Some other things just happened to go wrong, like my dahlias were delayed. Some of my herbs didn't do very well that normally do well, but that wasn't really my fault. I didn't do anything differently. It was just the nature of the season. But there are some other things I am going to do differently. That includes trying to find a good quality flexible hose. I like the flexible hoses because it's much easier. Since I garden on a deck, there's a lot of stuff on it. And it's much easier to get around and through things on my deck when I have a more flexible hose. I just got one from Amazon. The reviews were really bad, but I figured let's get something cheap to see if I like it rather than investing in something that's more expensive and realizing it doesn't quite work. But it did work until it started leaking, which was maybe a month or two into it. They are a little bit, not a lot more difficult to use. There's more that you have to do, like when you're done using the flexible hose, you have to make sure all of the water is emptied out of it. You also don't want to have it sitting in the sun, so I was like keeping it inside of a bucket. So there's just a little bit more care and maintenance that goes into it, but not enough to offset all of the advantages and how much easier it was for me to use. So I do have some, I think one of the brands is called like Zero something. I do have a list of brands that people on Instagram recommended. If you have any brands of flexible hoses that you really like, let me know, because that seems to be what works best for my garden. I know a lot of people use hose link, and I would love to have something that like retracts like that, but again, it's too stiff of a hose, I think, to really work for my garden. So the flexible hose seems like it would be the perfect solution for me, as long as I got one that actually worked and didn't start to leak just a few months into using it. Another thing I'm going to do differently is to try to get away from smaller containers. My problem is that I will plant all of the plants I have, whether I'm throwing them in like a 6 or 8 inch pot or not. And the 6 to 8 inch pots require a lot more maintenance. They need to be watered more often. So if we're gone for the weekend, I'm more nervous about those than I am like my larger pots. So I'm going to try to get away from as many small pots. I do feel like over the years I've gotten a little bit better. Really the only place I think I'm going to use them is in my herb rack, so the 8 inch terracotta pots, but there are some herbs that I'm going to plant in larger containers. But that's going to be my goal, is to reduce the number of smaller containers that I have in my garden and try to get larger containers and plant a few more different plants in there, just to make maintenance a lot easier for me. And next is something that I think I did do this year, although I think it was more out of laziness than anything else is to get less involved with insects. Now, I know I just said that I did a preventative spray for bedworms and that worked really well. I'm trying to decide if I'm going to do that next year or not. This is again something from my horticulture class, just understanding how all the insects work together. Like if there are pests, then typically you're also going to find some beneficials that are feeding off of those pests. And if I can create a diverse enough environment that hopefully everything should kind of take care of itself. Again, that doesn't mean that pests aren't going to damage your crops. And that is a concern for me. Again, with a smaller space, I have fewer plants. If I'm only growing 2 tomatoes and hornworms eat a lot of my tomatoes, I mean, that's it. It's not like I have 10 or 20 tomato plants to harvest from. So it's going to be a balance, but I am leaning more towards being hands-off and maybe just hand-picking anything that I see that doesn't seem to be getting taken care of. The hornworm problem that I've had in the past, so when I first started gardening, I had way too many tomato plants, like 4 tomato plants, and just a few other flowers in the garden, not very diverse, and I had the most hornworms that year, and the fewest other insects. I notice as it gets more diverse, I see a lot more wasps, which isn't always great for me because I am a little bit afraid of wasps. But the more wasps I have in the garden, the fewer other pests I have. The parasitic wasps feed on the hornworm larvae, so I haven't seen any hornworms this year, which is great. What else were they feeding on? I think they were feeding on the budworms too. They also feed, unfortunately, on like monarch and swallowtail caterpillars. But by having a garden that kind of attracts everything, or as much as possible, a lot of the pest versus beneficial balances itself out. So that's what I'm going to try to do next year, just be a little bit more hands-off and see how it goes. Because, let's see, other than budworms, I didn't really have, well, no, you know what, I had more scale than I normally do this year, but it doesn't seem like I had quite as many issues with pests as my garden gets larger and as I plant more, which is just very interesting because I would assume the more plants I have, the more issues I would have. So I'm just going to see how that goes next year, try to be a bit more hands-off, let nature do its thing, and then maybe step in with my hands and handpick, with gloves on, any of the insects that I see that don't seem to be getting taken care of. Now I'm trying to think if there's any other decisions I made that were very bad. I'm trying to think. I can't really think of anything. Another one that I wasn't just for this year, but I wish I had done in the past was add wheels to my elevated beds so that I can move them easily. It also helps like lift them a bit off the deck. So if you do get elevated beds for your deck, I would recommend adding wheels to them before you fill them with soil. But everything else, I think overall worked really well. It's incredible how much you learn gardening very quickly, but also there's still so much more that I don't know. But I like to be able to look back at the year and what I didn't do correctly or in the way that I wanted to, and then fix that for next year, because every year then my garden just gets better and better. So those are my worst decisions and what I'm going to do differently for the next garden season. Let me know what your worst decisions were, and anything that you're going to change, again, so that we can all learn from each other. So thank you so much for watching, and I will see you in the next video.